cutting versus boosting. Are you doing it wrong? Today I'm going to go over the pros and cons of cutting and boosting, a little bit of backstory on why people think certain things about cutting versus boosting, and then we're going to jump in Pro Tools, and we're actually going to compare some cuts versus some boosts, and by the end of this video, it will be crystal clear the differences between boosting and cutting and which you should do. So in my recent video, Magic is in the mid-range or mix tutorial I recently posted, I was pretty blown away by the number of comments that I got. People saying that, oh my god, he's boosting EQ, I can't believe it. There are so many people suggesting that I should only be cutting EQ, not boosting. Now, this is not the first time I've heard this argument, however, I was kind of surprised at the quantity of people that were under this impression. And so it got me thinking, after 18 years of mixing records, after thousands and thousands of songs that I've mixed, am I actually doing it wrong? Do I not know what I'm doing? What really are the differences between cutting and boosting EQ? And so I kind of fell down the rabbit hole. I did a bunch of research, I did a bunch of testing, I experimented for myself, and today we are going to get to the bottom of it. So there's basically two reasons why this idea became popular, that you should only cut and you should not boost EQ. And the first one comes from way back in the day, like when your grandpa was your age. Old mixing consoles had a noise floor to them. They were noisy, and the more you boosted EQ, the more that noise floor came up. And so across, 48 or 56 channels and you're boosting EQ everywhere, the quiet parts of the song could become quite noisy. And so way back in the day, people used to do more cutting than they would boosting in an effort to keep that noise floor quiet. In today's day and age, it's not an issue, and it's not even an issue for mixing consoles made in the last 25 or 30 years, so this one has sorted itself out. So the second reason people came to think you should cut and not boost is because when you boost EQ, you're actually introducing phase shift. This is how EQs work. And when you introduce this phase shift, you're eating up headroom on your mix bus. This was the idea. Now this is kind of a two-part problem here. First of all, obviously when you turn up the volume, let's say you boost a bunch of 1K, the track gets louder, and so the idea that it would eat up headroom, well, no one would just boost a bunch of frequencies and then leave the fader the exact same spot. You would boost to whatever tonal things you wanted to accomplish, and then you would pull the fader down and rebalance the track within the mix. That was appropriate for the mix, and so the idea that boosting EQ would eat up headroom on your mix bus because of its change in volume, well, to me, this is also a non-issue because you would always be balancing with your fader within the mix. You're not eating up headroom because of the increase in volume from boosting frequencies. Now the second part of this is actually because of the phase shift. And so the idea was that if you boost EQ, you're introducing phase shift, and that phase shift separately from the increase in volume eats up headroom in your mix bus. So this is where we have to actually jump into Pro Tools and do some experimentation and listen with our ears to examples to see what is better. Okay, so I'm gonna use the exact same song as I used in my Magic is in the Mid-Range video. If you haven't seen that video yet, I'll link it in the description of this video. Also in the description of this video, there'll be links to the plugins I'm using in this video and a whole bunch of other gear that I use. Let's check it out. So basically what I've done here is I have attempted to create the same EQ curves with both boosting and cutting. I have the auto gain on, as you can see right here. The auto gain is on, so this will keep the volume the exact same regardless of the EQ changes. Okay, so let's take a listen. This first one is an attempt to boost mid-range by cutting only, and I'm gonna A-B. So here is the vocal on its own. Yeah. Why am I the only one who's left in the rain? Okay, here's what I've done to it. Yeah. Why am I the only one who's left in the rain with nobody to hold on to? Ooh. Okay, now we're going to flip this to a boost only. Here's what it sounds like. Yeah. Why am I the only one who's left in the rain with nobody to hold on to? Ooh. Okay, now I'm gonna A-B them, flip back and forth in the middle of it. Yeah. Why am I the only one who's left in the rain with nobody to hold on to? Ooh. Why am I the only one who's feeling this pain when there should be? Okay, pretty pretty close, right? Pretty much the same thing. Let's try a different instance. In this case, I'm attempting to boost low and high end, and then same thing, I've matched the EQ curve using only cuts. Here's the vocal dry.
Yeah. Why am I the only one who's left in the rain?
Here's the vocal with this in.
Yeah. Why am I the only one who's left in the rain with nobody to hold on to? Ooh.
Here it is with only using a cut to try to achieve the same thing.
Yeah. Why am I the only one who's left in the rain with nobody to hold on to? Ooh.
Now I'm going to flip back and forth between them while it's playing.
Yeah. Why am I the only one who's left in the rain with nobody to hold on to? Ooh. Why am I the only one who's feeling this pain when there should be?
Okay, slight differences, but it's because I can't actually perfectly match the EQ curves when boosting and cutting. However, I have figured out how to put this to bed once and for all. We're gonna settle this right now. So I've got a duplicate here. Both vocals are exactly the same. And what I'm gonna do is we are going to use this EQ on one of them and this EQ on the other one. And so what we've got going on here is we have a high cut, a high shelf cut, 12 dB at 1K. And then on the other track, we've got a low shelf boost, 12 dB at 1K. Now, these should be exactly the same. They should sound the same. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna play both tracks simultaneously with these two EQs put in, and I'm gonna flip the phase on one of these EQs. Now, for those of you that don't know what this does, when you play two things that are the same, hopefully the same, and you flip the phase on one of them, whatever sound is left while it's playing with the polarity flipped on one of them is the difference between the two tracks. And so if I flip this phase and there's still some sound happening, you can still hear something, that means that there is actually a difference between boosting and cutting. However, if I flip this polarity and you hear nothing, and I assure you there's no video editing trickery happening here, then that means that this boost and this cut are indeed the exact same thing. All right, let's put both these plugins in. Let's make sure both of the vocals are soloed. They certainly are. Right here you can see. And let's give this a go. Here we go.
Yeah. Why am I the only one who's left in the rain?
Okay, so that's what it sounds like with it all playing together. I'm gonna flip this polarity right here in the middle of that line. Here we go.
Yeah. Why am I?
Oh, that's weird.
Hold on to? Ooh. Why am I the?
I don't hear anything. It goes completely away. So what this means is as long as you are able to perfectly match EQ curves, there effectively is no difference between boosting and cutting EQ. And if there was a difference between boosting and cutting, you would hear exactly what that difference was with that polarity flipped. Now, unfortunately, this is basically impossible to do on a hardware EQ or a hardware modeled EQ, a plug-in that is modeled after a piece of hardware, because it's impossible to actually match the EQ curves. So I'm not willing to tell you that there's absolutely no difference between boosting and cutting on any EQ out there, hardware or software. What I'm saying is with this plug-in, that we can actually match the curves perfectly. There is no difference between boosting and cutting. Okay, so now I'd like to take a moment to discuss how I decide when I should boost and when I should cut EQ. So most pro engineers, most engineers that do this for a living will tell you that they cut to solve problems and they boost to shape tone. So if there is a resonant frequency or a ring or a rumble or something, we will cut those frequencies. A lot of times with a very narrow cut or with a high pass filter, we'll cut the problems, the actual literal problems out of the track, most of the time with a very narrow cut. And then once I've fixed the actual problems within a track, then I commonly will boost with a much wider EQ, with a much wider curve, to shape the overall tone that I want the track to have. But to be fair, I'm just listening in context, and how I do it is whatever jumps out at me first is the first thing that I do. And so sometimes the guitar track instantly jumps out at me and it's a little too bitey and it's too harsh at like 2.5K. And so sometimes the first thing I'll do on a guitar track is I'll cut some 2.5K. Sometimes the very first thing that pops out to me within a mix about a vocal is there's not enough air on top. It's not shiny enough. And so my first reach for a vocal might be to boost a bunch of 10 or 15 or 20K. That kick drum might not have enough sub bass, and that might be the first thing that jumps out at me. And so the first thing I might do is reach for 40 or 50, somewhere between 40 and 80 hertz and boost that. That might be the first thing that I do. Simultaneously, that kick drum might seem boxy and woofy and lack clarity. And so maybe the first thing that I do is I cut somewhere between 200 and 300 hertz. Now, my point here is that what I do is I'm listening to the information that's being given to me from the speakers, and I'm just reacting. What's the first thing that I hear that I'd like to change? Sometimes it means that I'm boosting EQ, and sometimes it means that I'm cutting EQ. But what I really want you to take away from this video is stop just believing everything that you read. Stop just believing everything that you see on YouTube. Use your ears. If it sounds good, it is good, and any engineer that's not full of shit will tell you that. If cutting EQ gets you the results that you're after, awesome. Continue doing that. If boosting EQ gets you the results you are after, fantastic. The key is that you experiment and that you know why you're doing what you're doing. Not just that you're doing it because so-and-so told you that this is the right way to do it. I EQ the way that I do because it gets me to the finish line in the fewest moves as possible. It's one of my singular goals when I'm mixing. How do I get to the finish line where the song is finished, there are no more changes to be made, in as few a moves as possible? Now, I'm specifically talking about EQ in this case, but pretty much overall in as few moves as possible. So if a track needs a bunch of 1K, I'm not gonna high pass it and then cut with a low shelf and then cut with the high shelf so that way there's a bunch of 1K left. No, I'm just gonna grab 1K and I'm gonna boost it because I want to get to the finish line in as few moves as possible. Now, when we were talking earlier about phase shift and the idea that it might eat up headroom within your mix, this is part of the reason why I try to get to the finish line in as few moves as possible, because the fewer EQ moves I can make within a song, the less phase shift there is overall within a song. And for me, this gives me a better result. Try it, and if you can get better results, awesome. And if you can't, good on you. At least you experimented and you tried something and you learned something. You now know why you do what you do or why you don't do what you don't do. Finish line in as few moves as possible is my entire philosophy within mixing. I hope this helped you. Thank you guys so much for watching all the way to the end. Love each and every one of you. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell next to the subscribe tab, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.